When Barron Trump discovered his quiet classmate was secretly homeless, he couldn't just stand by. What happened next shocked everyone, from the school hallways to his own family, and sparked a chain of kindness no one saw coming. Barron Trump sat quietly in the back of his classroom, flipping through the last few pages of his assigned reading. The teacher's voice faded into the background as he absent-mindedly traced the corner of the book with his finger. It was just another school day at his prestigious private academy, where students came from families of wealth, power, and influence. Most of his classmates were the children of CEOs, diplomats, and celebrities. Some were even the heirs to billion-dollar fortunes. But for Barron, despite his last name being one of the most recognizable in the world, he never let it define him. He preferred to stay out of the spotlight, quietly excelling in his studies and keeping a small but trusted circle of friends. That's when he noticed something. A few seats ahead, his classmate, a boy named Adam, was staring blankly at his open notebook. His pencil remained untouched, and there was a distant, almost hollow look in his eyes. Adam was different from the rest of the students at the academy. He wasn't from a wealthy background. In fact, he had only been able to attend the school on a full academic scholarship. One of the few students in their grade who didn't come from privilege, but he never let that define him either. He worked harder than most, earning top marks and showing an unmatched dedication to his education. Barron had spoken to Adam a few times before. He was quiet but kind, always staying late in the library and helping out younger students with their work. But lately, something had changed. Adam had become withdrawn. He barely spoke, avoided eye contact, and seemed exhausted every single day. That day during lunch, Barron couldn't ignore it anymore. He spotted Adam sitting alone at the far end of the cafeteria, absently poking at a small bag of pretzels. The usual lively chatter of students filled the air, but Adam sat in silence. Barron made a decision. He grabbed his tray and walked over. "Hey, mind if I sit?" he asked casually. Adam looked up, startled. He hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, sure." Barron sat across from him and took a bite of his sandwich. "You good, man?" Adam blinked, as if caught off guard by the question. "Yeah, just tired." He forced a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Barron wasn't convinced. "You sure? You've seemed kinda different lately." Adam hesitated. He glanced around the room, then lowered his voice. "It's nothing, really. Just some stuff going on at home." Barron raised an eyebrow. "Stuff like what?" There was a long pause. Adam seemed to weigh his words carefully before finally exhaling. I don't really have a home anymore." Barron froze. "Wait, what?" Adam shrugged, trying to play it off like it wasn't a big deal. "My mom lost her job a few months ago. We couldn't afford rent anymore. We've been staying in our car." For the first time in a long time, Barron was at a loss for words. He looked at Adam, taking in the dark circles under his eyes, the way his clothes were slightly wrinkled like they hadn't been properly washed, the way he barely touched his food. "How long?" Barron finally asked. "A little over 2 months," Adam admitted. "But it's fine. I'm handling it." Handling it. Those words sat heavily with Barron. Adam was acting like it was just another challenge, like failing a test or missing a homework assignment. But this wasn't normal. This wasn't something anyone should have to handle alone. Barron didn't press further. Instead, he simply said, "All right." But inside, his mind was already racing. That night, Barron couldn't shake the conversation from his head. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his massive bedroom. His room alone was probably bigger than the entire space Adam and his mom had in their car. He thought about all the things he had, things he'd never had to worry about. A warm bed, a stocked fridge, a house with more rooms than they even used. And Adam had nothing. Barron knew he had to do something, but he had no idea just how much his next move would change everything. The next morning, Barron walked into school with a plan. He didn't know exactly how to fix everything, but he knew he couldn't just sit back and pretend nothing was wrong. He kept glancing over at Adam during class, noticing things he hadn't paid attention to before, like how he seemed to wear the same two hoodies on rotation, or how he was always the first to leave at the end of the day, like he didn't want anyone to see where he was going. By lunchtime, Barron had made up his mind. As soon as the bell rang, he caught up to Adam in the hallway. "Hey, you got a second?" Barron asked casually. Adam looked wary. Yeah?" Barron hesitated for a second before getting straight to the point. "Look, man, I know you said you're handling it, but that's not okay. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone." Adam stiffened. "I told you, we're fine." "No, you're not," Barron cut in, his voice firm but not unkind. "You barely sleep, you barely eat. You're trying to act like everything's normal, but it's not. And it's okay to admit that." Adam looked down at his sneakers, his jaw tightening. I don't want people feeling sorry for me." "It's not about feeling sorry for you," Barron said. "It's about making sure you're okay, and you're not." Adam let out a breath, shaking his head. "Even if I wanted to do something about it, I can't. We don't have the money for a place, and shelters are always full." Barron nodded slowly, processing everything. Then he said something that made Adam's head snap up. "What if I helped?" Adam narrowed his eyes. "Help how?" Barron hesitated, knowing this was going to sound crazy. "I don't know yet, but I will." Adam looked at him for a long time, as if trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. But Barron wasn't laughing. Finally, Adam sighed. "Barron, I appreciate it, but some things can't be fixed just because you want them to be." Barron crossed his arms. "Watch me." That night, Barron sat at the dinner table, barely touching his food. His mother, Melania, noticed immediately. "Barron, are you feeling all right?" she asked, tilting her head. He nodded absent-mindedly. "Yeah, just thinking." His father, Donald Trump, set down his fork and gave him a curious look. "Thinking about what?" Barron hesitated. He knew his father wasn't exactly the sentimental type, and this wasn't just any problem. It was personal. But he also knew that if anyone could actually do something about it, it was his family. So he took a deep breath and said, "A friend of mine is homeless." The words hung in the air. Melania's eyes widened slightly. "At your school?" Barron nodded. "Yeah, he and his mom have been living in their car." For a moment, neither of his parents said anything. Then his father leaned back in his chair. "And what are you planning to do about it?" Barron met his father's gaze. "Help him." Donald Trump smirked slightly, like he respected the boldness in his son's voice. "And how exactly do you plan on doing that?" Barron swallowed. "I don't know yet, but we have enough resources to do something." His father exhaled, rubbing his chin. "You know, when I was your age, I wasn't worried about other people's problems. I was thinking about how to build my own empire." Barron's jaw clenched. "So, you're saying I shouldn't help?" Donald shrugged. "I'm saying, if you want to help, do it the right way. You don't just throw money at a problem and hope it goes away. You think about a solution, a real one." Barron narrowed his eyes. "Then tell me, what's the real solution?" Donald studied him for a moment, then smiled slightly. "You tell me, kid." Melania placed a gentle hand on Barron's. "If this is something you truly care about, then we'll support you." Barron nodded, determination setting in. He had his parents' attention. Now, he just needed a plan. The next day, Barron spent every free moment researching. He looked up temporary housing programs, rental assistance options, and even jobs that Adam's mom might be able to get. But the deeper he dug, the more frustrated he became. Everything had long wait lists. The shelters were packed. The process for getting real help took weeks, sometimes months. That wasn't good enough. So, Barron did something drastic. After school, he called a real estate agent. "Hi," he said, clearing his throat. "I'm looking for a rental property, something safe in a good neighborhood. It doesn't have to be huge, just..." Enough for a small family. The agent sounded confused at first, but after a few more questions, they agreed to send over some listings. By the time Barron got home, his phone was filled with pictures of apartments and small houses available for rent. He scrolled through them, stopping on a cozy two-bedroom place just outside the city. It wasn't extravagant, but it was warm, safe, a place someone could call home. Now, he just had to make it happen. The next morning, Barron walked straight up to his father in his office. "I found a place," he said, holding up his phone. Donald raised an eyebrow. "A place for what?" "For Adam and his mom," Barron said. "It's not a mansion or anything, just an apartment, but it's perfect for them." His father leaned back, studying the photo. "And?" Barron took a deep breath. "I want to pay for it." Donald's expression didn't change. "With what money?" Barron set his jaw. "I'll use my own." Donald chuckled. "Your own money, huh? And how much do you have?" Barron hesitated. "I have savings." Donald smirked. "Kid, your savings won't cover 6 months of rent." Barron didn't flinch. "Then loan it to me." Donald blinked, clearly surprised by the response. "You want a loan?" Barron nodded. "Yes, I'll pay you back." For the first time in the conversation, his father looked genuinely impressed. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "So, let me get this straight. You want to take out a loan from me to pay for a home for someone else, and then pay me back with what? Your lunch money?" "I'll work," Barron said simply. "I'll find a way." Donald exhaled, shaking his head with a small chuckle. "You really are something else." He glanced at the phone screen again, tapping his fingers against the desk. "All right, fine. I'll cover the rent for the first year." Barron's heart leaped. "Wait, really?" His father nodded. "But," he raised a finger, "you're responsible for what happens next. If this kid and his mom need jobs, stability, whatever, that's on you to figure out. I'm not bailing them out forever." Barron didn't even hesitate. "Deal." Donald smirked. "All right then. You've got yourself a loan." Barron shook his father's hand, feeling a surge of excitement and relief. Adam and his mom weren't going to be homeless anymore. But what neither Barron nor his father realized was that this small act of kindness, it was about to turn into something much, much bigger. That evening, Barron sat on his bed, staring at the ceiling. He had done it, secured a home for Adam and his mom. But his father was right. This wasn't just about paying rent. It was about stability, a future. If Adam and his mother didn't have jobs or a way to sustain themselves, they could end up right back where they started. And that wasn't an option, so Barron picked up his phone and started making calls. First, he called a local business owner his father had worked with in the past, a man who ran a chain of grocery stores in the area. "Mr. Reynolds, hi, this is Barron Trump. I was wondering if you had any job openings right now." Mr. Reynolds sounded surprised. "Barron, what kind of job are you looking for?" "It's not for me," Barron clarified. "It's for someone I know. She's hardworking, reliable, and just needs a chance." Reynolds was quiet for a moment before he said, "I can probably get her something at one of the stores. Cashier, stock work, nothing glamorous, but it's steady pay. Think she'd be interested?" Barron grinned. "Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. You won't regret it." One problem solved, but there was still Adam. The next day at school, Barron pulled Adam aside between classes. "All right," he said. "Your mom has a job." Adam blinked. "What?" Barron nodded. "I talked to someone last night. There's a position for her at a grocery store. It's not fancy, but it's work. And we found a place for you guys to stay." Adam just stared at him, his hands tightening into fists. "Why are you doing this?" Barron met his gaze without hesitation. "Because I can." For a long time, Adam said nothing. Then he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You don't get it. I've spent my whole life hearing people say they'd help, and they never do. I don't want charity. This isn't charity, Barron said firmly. It's a second chance. You and your mom deserve that. Adam swallowed hard. For the first time, his tough exterior cracked just a little. Okay, he said quietly. Barron smiled. Good, but there's one more thing. Adam raised an eyebrow. What now? You need a job too, Barron said. Something that gives you experience, money, and a way to build something for yourself. Adam scoffed. Yeah, you got a job lined up for me too? Barron smirked. Actually, yeah. Adam blinked. Wait, what? Barron shrugged. My dad owns hotels, and I made a few calls. There's a position open at one of them. Entry level, but it pays well and has room to grow. You interested? Adam just stared at him. You got me a job at a Trump hotel? Barron grinned. I pulled some strings. Adam shook his head, a small, stunned laugh escaping his lips. Dude, I don't know what to say. Barron clapped him on the shoulder. Say yes. Adam hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, okay, yes. And just like that, everything changed. That weekend, Barron took Adam and his mom to see their new apartment. When Adam's mom stepped inside, she covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. It's beautiful, she whispered. Adam looked around, still in disbelief. How did you even… Barron shrugged. I had some help. Adam turned to him, his jaw tightening. Barron, I'll never be able to repay you for this. Barron smiled. You don't have to. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Adam's mom started her new job. Adam worked at the hotel, and for the first time in a long time, they weren't just surviving. They were living. But then, something unexpected happened. One morning, as Barron scrolled through his phone before school, he saw an article trending online. Barron Trump secretly helps classmate out of homelessness. His heart stopped. How did this get out? He clicked the article, reading in horror. Someone must have talked. Maybe a teacher, maybe one of the business owners he called. The story was everywhere now. By the time he got to school, students were whispering. Teachers looked at him with something close to admiration. Even Adam had a stunned look on his face. Dude, Adam said, holding up his phone, we're literally on the news. Barron ran a hand down his face. I didn't want this to be public. Adam shook his head. Well, it is, and people are going crazy over it. Barron exhaled. Great. But what happened next? He never could have predicted. That afternoon, his father called him into his office. Son, Donald Trump said, holding up his phone. What the hell is this? Barron swallowed hard. I didn't mean for this to get out. His father studied him for a long moment, then smirked. You know, I thought you had my business instincts, but it turns out you've got something else. Barron frowned. What's that? Donald leaned back in his chair. A damn good heart. Barron blinked. Donald exhaled. You made me proud, kid. I mean it. Barron felt something warm in his chest. His father wasn't the type to hand out compliments lightly. Then Donald stood. But now, we're going bigger. Barron tilted his head. What do you mean? Donald grinned. You think I'm gonna let my son be the only one making headlines for this? If we're gonna do this, we do it right. Barron stared. Wait, are you saying… His father clapped him on the shoulder. We're launching a program to help homeless families. And you, my boy, you're the face of it. Barron's jaw dropped. Donald smirked. Now let's get to work. And just like that, one act of kindness turned into a movement that would change thousands of lives forever. Barron sat in his room that night, staring at his phone, scrolling through article after article about what had happened. Every news outlet had picked up the story. Some praised him, calling him an example of leadership and kindness. Others were skeptical, debating whether it was a publicity stunt. The comments were mixed, but one thing was clear. People were talking. and that meant people were paying attention. He set his phone down and exhaled, running a hand through his hair. His father's words from earlier echoed in his mind. "We're launching a program to help homeless families." The words sounded huge, overwhelming even. Barron had done one thing for one family. He hadn't expected it to spiral into something bigger. But his father wasn't the type to do anything halfway. A knock at the door made him sit up. His mother, Melania, stepped inside, her expression unreadable. She held up her own phone, the screen still glowing with an article about him. "You did a good thing, Barron," she said, her voice softer than usual. Barron looked away. "I didn't want people to know." Melania sat beside him, setting her phone on the bed. "And yet they do." She studied him for a moment. "Are you upset about that?" Barron sighed. "I don't know. I didn't do it for attention. I did it because it was the right thing to do." A small smile touched her lips. "That is why it matters." Barron didn't respond. Melania reached over and squeezed his hand. "No matter what anyone says, you helped someone who needed it. That is all that matters." Barron nodded slowly. He knew she was right. But he also knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, his father called him into his office again. "We need to move fast," Donald said, pacing behind his desk. "This is a moment, and moments like this, you don't waste them." Barron sat across from him, arms crossed. "I just wanted to help Adam, that's all." His father nodded. "And now you're going to help a lot more people." He tapped his phone screen and turned it around. It was a draft press release. The headline? "Trump Organization announces new initiative to help homeless families." Barron's stomach flipped. "This is really happening?" Donald smirked. "Damn right it is." Barron hesitated. "How?" "We start with housing," his father explained. "Short-term shelters, partnerships with landlords, whatever we can do. Then we add job placements, training programs, real opportunities." Barron took a deep breath. "And you want me involved?" Donald raised an eyebrow. "It was your idea, wasn't it?" Barron scoffed. "I just paid for an apartment. That's not a program." "No," Donald said, "but it started one." Barron sat back, trying to process it all. "Look, kid," his father continued, "I know you don't like the spotlight, but you're already in it. And if you play this right, you can actually make a difference." Barron met his gaze. "You really think so?" Donald nodded. "I know so." Barron exhaled. "Okay, I'm in." His father grinned. "That's my boy." Over the next few weeks, everything moved at lightning speed. Barron found himself in meetings he never expected to be in, talking to housing organizations, business leaders, even government officials. The initiative was growing faster than anyone had expected. People wanted to be part of it. Companies offered funding. Developers offered properties. News stations followed every move. Adam and his mom became the faces of the program's success. One day, as Barron walked through one of the newly renovated housing units for struggling families, Adam walked beside him, shaking his head in disbelief. "You know this is insane, right?" Adam said. Barron smirked. "A little." Adam turned to him. "Seriously, you took one act of kindness and turned it into this." Barron shrugged. "It's not just me. A lot of people are helping." Adam chuckled. "Yeah, but it started with you." Barron didn't respond. He just looked around, taking it all in. This was real. Families were moving in. Kids were smiling. Parents were getting second chances. And he had played a part in that. Later that night, Barron sat on his balcony, staring at the city lights, lost in thought. His phone buzzed. A text from his father. "Proud of you, kid. This is only the beginning." Barron smiled. He had no idea where this would go next, but for the first time, he was excited to find out. And in the end, one small act of kindness had changed more than just one life. It had started a movement that would continue long after the headlines faded. And Barron? He was just getting started. In the weeks that followed, Barron found himself navigating a world he never thought he'd be part of. Business meetings, charity galas, press conferences. His life had changed overnight. He had always been used to living in the public eye, but now people weren't just watching him because of his last name. They were watching because he had done something real, something meaningful. And for the first time, he realized what kind of power that held. But with that power came responsibility. The Trump Homeless Initiative, what the media had started calling it, had exploded in ways no one had anticipated. The number of applications for assistance was overwhelming. Families, veterans, single mothers, even kids who had aged out of foster care. Thousands of people needed help, and they were looking to Barron, of all people, for answers. At first, he felt completely out of his depth. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a businessman. He was just a kid who had wanted to help a friend. But as he sat in meetings, listening to experts explain the logistics of homelessness, affordable housing, and job placement programs, he started to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about Adam. This was about all the kids like Adam. And once Barron realized that, he knew there was no turning back. One afternoon, he visited one of the housing projects they had funded. It was a modest apartment complex that had been renovated and repurposed for families in need. He walked through the hallways, stopping to talk to some of the new residents. A little girl, no older than 6, peeked out from behind her mother's leg as Barron approached. She had big brown eyes and clutched a tattered stuffed bunny in her arms. "What's his name?" Barron asked, kneeling down to her level. The girl hesitated before whispering, "Mr. Hops." Barron smiled. "That's a great name." The girl's mother wiped her eyes, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you. We were in a shelter before this. My daughter never had her own room before. Now she does." Barron felt his throat tighten. He wasn't used to this kind of gratitude. He wasn't doing this for recognition. He was doing it because it was right. But moments like this reminded him why it all mattered. As he walked outside, Adam caught up with him, shaking his head. "Dude, do you even realize what you're doing?" Barron glanced over. "What do you mean?" Adam gestured around them. "This. People's lives are changing because of you. You don't have to be here, but you are. And that means something." Barron sighed, staring at the horizon. "I just don't want to mess it up." Adam chuckled. "Trust me, you won't." But not everyone wanted to see him succeed. As the initiative gained more attention, critics started emerging from the shadows. Some claimed it was a publicity stunt. Others said the Trump family was only doing this for political gain. Talk shows debated whether Barron was just another rich kid playing hero. And then came the real threat. A powerful real estate mogul, one who had built his fortune on overpriced rental properties and eviction practices, publicly denounced Barron's initiative. He saw affordable housing as a direct threat to his empire, and he wasn't about to let a teenager ruin his business. Barron first heard about him in a meeting with his father. "This guy is a shark," Donald warned. "He's been making money off desperate people for decades, and now he thinks you're bad for business." Barron frowned. "So what do we do?" Donald smirked. "We don't back down." But that was easier said than done. Within days, lawsuits were filed against the initiative, claiming it was illegally using government land for private housing projects. Banks that had initially promised funding suddenly pulled out. News outlets started running hit pieces, questioning whether Barron was really behind the program or if his father was just using him as a pawn. The pressure was intense. One night, Barron sat in his room, scrolling through headlines. The excitement he had once felt was fading, replaced by frustration. No matter how much good he did, there would always be people trying to tear him down. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Adam. "Ignore the noise. Focus on the people you're helping. That's all that matters." Barron exhaled. Adam was right. He stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked out onto the balcony. The city stretched before him, glittering with lights. Somewhere out there, Families were sleeping in their new homes because of him. Kids were safe. Parents had a fresh start, and no lawsuit or hit piece could change that. The next morning, Barron walked into his father's office with a new energy. "We're not stopping," he said firmly. Donald grinned. "Attaboy." And just like that, the fight continued. The Trump initiative doubled down, securing private donors who couldn't be intimidated by corporate threats. They partnered with veterans organizations, churches, and independent landlords willing to rent to struggling families. They worked with legal teams to navigate the lawsuits, refusing to let bureaucracy slow them down. And the biggest moment of all? A massive rally was announced in New York City. Thousands of people showed up. Families who had been helped, supporters who believed in the mission, and even celebrities who wanted to back the cause. Barron stood on stage looking out at the crowd. He had never seen anything like it. Then his father stepped forward, clapping him on the shoulder. Barron stepped up to the microphone. He took a deep breath. "I never wanted to be in the spotlight," he admitted. "I never planned for any of this to happen. But I saw someone who needed help, and I did something about it. And now, we're not just helping one person. We're helping thousands." The crowd erupted. Barron continued, his voice steady. "They said we couldn't do it. They said we'd fail. But look around you. We are changing lives, and we're just getting started." As the cheers filled the air, Barron knew this wasn't just a project anymore. This was a movement, and he wasn't walking away. He was all in, and nothing was going to stop him. The days that followed the rally were a whirlwind. Media coverage exploded, painting Barron as an unexpected leader in the fight against homelessness. Interviews, articles, and opinion pieces flooded the internet. Some praised his efforts, calling him a young visionary. Others were skeptical, claiming he was too inexperienced to make a lasting impact. But Barron didn't have time to worry about the critics. He had work to do. The Trump Homeless Initiative had gained momentum, but the challenges were far from over. Every time they secured housing for one family, 10 more applications came in. Every time they raised funds, someone tried to block their progress. And now, the real estate mogul who had declared war on their efforts was launching a full-scale attack. Barron was in a meeting when the news broke. A new lawsuit had been filed, not just against the initiative, but against him personally. The claim? That he was illegally interfering with housing markets and causing financial harm to major property owners. Barron scoffed as he read the headlines. "This is insane," he muttered, tossing the tablet onto the table. "They're suing me for helping people?" Donald leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. "They're not suing you because of what you're doing. They're suing you because they're scared you'll succeed." Barron frowned. "So what do we do?" His father smirked. "We fight back." The Trump legal team was already preparing their response, but Barron wanted to do more than just defend himself. He wanted to go on the offensive. He picked up the phone and made a call. "We need to expose them," he told his PR team. "These guys have been profiting off struggling families for years. I want every shady deal, every illegal eviction, every corrupt contract they've signed. We're not just fighting this lawsuit. We're showing the world who they really are." And just like that, the battle lines were drawn. A week later, a bombshell report was released. It exposed the billionaire real estate mogul who had been fighting against Barron's initiative. The report detailed decades of exploitative rent hikes, mass evictions, and lobbying efforts to block affordable housing projects. The public backlash was immediate. News stations ran the story nonstop. Social media erupted in outrage. And then, the unthinkable happened. A whistleblower, a former employee of the real estate mogul, came forward with evidence that proved he had been bribing city officials to shut down homeless shelters and keep housing costs high. It was over. By the time the lawsuit reached court, the case had collapsed. Barron had won. But victory wasn't enough. He didn't want to just defeat his enemies. He wanted to ensure they could never hurt anyone again. So he made another bold move. Using funds from private donors, he launched the Home First Project, a revolutionary program designed to provide not just temporary shelters, but permanent housing for the homeless. Unlike other programs that placed people in rundown apartments or overcrowded shelters, Home First provided quality, fully furnished homes in safe neighborhoods. And instead of treating homelessness like a charity case, the program focused on long-term stability, job training, mental health services, and financial planning. Critics called it unrealistic. They said it wouldn't last. But within 6 months, over 5,000 families had been placed into permanent homes, and the numbers kept growing. One afternoon, Barron visited one of the newest Home First communities. He walked through the rows of townhouses, greeting families who had once been sleeping in their cars or living in shelters. Children played in the yards. Parents smiled as they carried groceries into their homes. The transformation was undeniable. Then, he spotted a familiar face, Adam. His old classmate stood on the porch of his new home, looking out at the community with an expression of disbelief. When he saw Barron, he broke into a wide grin. "You actually did it," Adam said, shaking his head. "You changed everything," Barron chuckled. "I had some help." Adam gestured toward the street, where families were laughing, talking, living. "Do you realize how big this is? These people had nothing, and now they have homes, because of you." Barron took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. "Because of us," he corrected. "This was never just about me." Adam nodded, his smile never fading. "So, what's next?" Barron looked around, then glanced back at his friend. "We keep going." And they did. Over the next year, Home First expanded nationwide. Cities that once struggled with homelessness saw real progress for the first time in decades. Other organizations followed Barron's lead, replicating his model in different states. Even international leaders took notice. At a global summit on poverty and housing, Barron was invited to speak. As he stood at the podium facing world leaders, economists, and activists, he realized just how far he had come. He wasn't just a Trump. He wasn't just a rich kid who had stumbled into philanthropy. He was a leader. And as he spoke, sharing the stories of the people he had met, the families who had found hope again, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a chapter in his life. This was his mission. And he wasn't stopping anytime soon. The years that followed cemented Barron's initiative as more than just a moment of kindness. It became a movement. What started as a simple act of generosity toward a friend had grown into a nationwide transformation, a revolution in the way homelessness was understood and addressed. The Home First Project wasn't just placing families in houses, it was changing lives. But not everyone was happy about it. As Home First expanded, powerful interests that had once profited from the housing crisis found themselves losing control. Property developers, banks, and even certain politicians had relied on the status quo, a system where housing scarcity drove up prices, where struggling families were trapped in cycles of poverty. They saw Home First not as a solution, but as a threat. One evening, Barron sat in his office, reviewing the latest progress reports. Over 50,000 families had now found permanent homes. Cities that once had sprawling tent encampments were reporting unprecedented drops in homelessness. His plan was working. The impact of Barron's initiative continued to ripple across the nation, but with success came even greater challenges. The powerful elite, who had spent decades profiting off the housing crisis, weren't done fighting back. Their next move was more insidious. Late one night, Barron sat in his office, scrolling through reports of newly housed families. He had just finished reading an email from a single mother who had spent years bouncing between shelters. Now, because of Home First, she and her 2 children finally had a place to call their own. Barron exhaled deeply, satisfaction settling in his chest. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. "Hello?" A voice, distorted by a voice modulator, spoke on the other end. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The call ended. Barron sat there for a long moment, gripping the phone. He wasn't afraid. He was angry. Because now, it was personal. The next morning, his security team reviewed the call, but it was untraceable. "Probably just some corporate goon trying to scare you," Taylor said. But the concern in her eyes betrayed her words. Barron had expected pushback, but the hostility had escalated. He needed to be prepared. That same day, news broke that multiple landlords and developers were filing a class action lawsuit against Home First. The claim? That Barron's initiative was artificially lowering rental prices and unfairly competing with the private market. It was absurd. Barron knew that these lawsuits weren't about legality. They were about stalling him. If they could drag Home First through enough court battles, it could bleed funding, slowing down its expansion and ultimately suffocating it under legal fees. Barron was furious, but he wasn't reckless. He needed a new strategy. Instead of fighting in court for years, he made a counter move no one saw coming. He went to the people. In a surprise announcement, Barron revealed that Home First would begin crowdfunding its next phase, allowing the public to directly invest in new housing projects. The response was explosive. Within 24 hours, the campaign had raised over $50 million. Within a week, over $500 million. Millions of people were donating, investing, and rallying behind the movement. Celebrities, athletes, tech moguls, they all started pouring in support. The lawsuits, they didn't matter anymore, because now, the people owned the solution. And that was something the corporations couldn't stop. But the fight wasn't over yet. One evening, Barron received an unexpected visit. His assistant led in an older man, well-dressed, composed, but with a sharp, calculating gaze. "Mr. Trump," the man said smoothly, extending a hand. "My name is Arthur Langley. I represent some concerned parties." Barron didn't shake his hand. Arthur chuckled. "Straight to business, then. I admire that." He took a seat without being invited. "You've made quite a name for yourself, Barron," Arthur continued. "Your initiative is, what's the word? Disruptive." Barron leaned forward. "Good." Arthur smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The people I represent don't see it that way. They believe in a structured economy. They believe in keeping things predictable." "And by predictable, you mean profitable," Barron said flatly. Arthur sighed. "Let me put it plainly. We're offering you a way out. Walk away from Home First, announce its closure, and we'll make sure you're compensated, generously." Barron stared at him. "You're trying to buy me out." Arthur shrugged. "Everyone has a price." Barron didn't hesitate. "You don't have enough money in the world." Arthur's smile faded. "You're making a mistake," he said, standing. "A very costly mistake." Barron met his gaze without flinching. You made a mistake the second you thought I could be bought." Arthur turned to leave. But before he did, he left Barron with a final warning. "This is bigger than you think, Barron. You've stepped on toes you can't even see. Be careful. The world has a way of correcting disruptions." And then he was gone. He wasn't afraid. He was angry. Because now, it was personal. The next morning, his security team reviewed the call, but it was untraceable. "Probably just some corporate goon trying to scare you," Taylor said, but the concern in her eyes betrayed her words. Barron had expected pushback, but the hostility had escalated. He needed to be prepared. That same day, news broke that multiple landlords and developers were filing a class action lawsuit against Home First. The claim? That Barron's initiative was artificially lowering rental prices and unfairly competing with the private market. It was absurd. Barron knew that these lawsuits weren't about legality. They were about stalling him. If they could drag Home First through enough court battles, it could bleed funding, slowing down its expansion and ultimately suffocating it under legal fees. Barron was furious. But he wasn't reckless. He needed a new strategy. Instead of fighting in court for years, he made a counter move no one saw coming. He went to the people. In a surprise announcement, Barron revealed that Home First would begin crowdfunding its next phase, allowing the public to directly invest in new housing projects. The response was explosive. Within 24 hours, the campaign had raised over $50 million. Within a week, over $500 million. Millions of people were donating, investing, and rallying behind the movement. Celebrities, athletes, tech moguls, they all started pouring in support. The lawsuits, they didn't matter anymore, because now, the people owned the solution, and that was something the corporations couldn't stop. But the fight wasn't over yet. One evening, Barron received an unexpected visit. His assistant led in an older man, well-dressed, composed, but with a sharp, calculating gaze. "Mr. Trump," the man said smoothly, extending a hand. "My name is Arthur Langley. I represent some concerned parties." Barron didn't shake his hand. Arthur chuckled. "Straight to business, then. I admire that." He took a seat without being invited. "You've made quite a name for yourself, Barron," Arthur continued. "Your initiative is, what's the word? Disruptive." Barron leaned forward. "Good." Arthur smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The people I represent don't see it that way. They believe in a structured economy. They believe in keeping things predictable. And by predictable, you mean profitable," Barron said flatly. Arthur sighed. "Let me put it plainly. We're offering you a way out. Walk away from Home First, announce its closure, and we'll make sure you're compensated. Generously." Barron stared at him. "You're trying to buy me out." Arthur shrugged. "Everyone has a price." Barron didn't hesitate. "You don't have enough money in the world." Arthur's smile faded. "You're making a mistake," he said, standing. "A very costly mistake." Barron met his gaze without flinching. "You made a mistake the second you thought I could be bought." Arthur turned to leave. But before he did, he left Barron with a final warning. "This is bigger than you think, Barron. You've stepped on toes you can't even see. Be careful. The world has a way of correcting disruptions." And then he was gone. Barron knew what that meant. They weren't going to bribe him. They were going to destroy him. And he was ready for it. Because what they didn't understand was that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the millions of people who now had hope. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away. The pressure was mounting, but Barron had never been one to back down from a fight, especially one that determined the future of millions. He knew that Arthur Langley and the corporate elite wouldn't stop at failed lawsuits or veiled threats. They had too much to lose. And he was right. Because the next attack, it wasn't just against Home First. It was against Barron himself. The media blitz. Within days of rejecting Arthur's offer, a wave of hit pieces flooded the internet. Major news outlets suddenly had anonymous sources claiming Barron was inexperienced and reckless with Home First's finances. A viral report accused him of using donations for personal gain. They dug up old interviews, twisted his words, painted him as a rich kid playing philanthropist. The headlines were brutal. "Barron Trump's housing initiative, a disaster in the making. Ex-Home First employee speaks out, it's all a sham. Barron Trump, naive or dangerous." It was a coordinated attack designed to destroy his credibility. And for a moment, it almost worked. Donations slowed. Investors hesitated. Even some of his supporters started to question everything. His team was in crisis mode. Taylor stormed into his office, slamming a stack of articles on his desk. "This isn't random, Barron. Someone's pulling the strings." "I know," Barron said calmly. "What do we do?" she demanded. "Issue a statement? Fight back? Sue for defamation?" Barron exhaled slowly, then looked up at her. "No," he said. "We double down." Taylor blinked. "What?" They expect me to defend myself, Barron said. They expect me to fight them on their terms, but I'm not playing by their rules. He stood, grabbed his coat, and started toward the door. Where are you going? Taylor asked. Barron turned, eyes burning with determination. To show the world the truth. The unscripted broadcast. That night, instead of issuing a polished statement or fighting back through the press, Barron did something no one expected. He went live. No script, no PR team, no teleprompter. Just Barron, standing in front of a small, run-down apartment. This is Maria, Barron said, turning the camera to a woman standing beside him. Maria was a mother of 3 who had spent years struggling in shelters, working 2 jobs just to survive. But today, Barron continued, she's home. He stepped inside, showing the world exactly what Home First had done. He walked through the apartment, showing the newly furnished rooms, the stocked fridge, the beds her children finally had to sleep in. Then he turned back to the camera. You can listen to the news, Barron said, or you can look at this. This isn't about me. It never was. It's about people like Maria, people who have been ignored for too long. Then he turned the camera to Maria. And she? She spoke from the heart. They're saying bad things about Barron, she said, voice shaking. But I don't care what they say, because before this, my kids had nowhere to sleep, and now, tears welled in her eyes, they have a home. The video broke the internet. In less than 24 hours, it hit 100 million views. Celebrities and influencers rallied behind him. Donations, they skyrocketed. Barron flipped the narrative. Instead of playing defense, he forced the world to see the truth with their own eyes. And the corporate elite? They panicked, because they had just lost control. But they weren't done yet, because their next move was something far more dangerous. And this time, they weren't just coming for his reputation. They were coming for his life. And that's when the first anonymous threat arrived. An email. No sender, no trace. Just a single message. Stop, or we'll stop you. Barron's first reaction was to laugh. Really? They thought they could scare him into backing down. He ignored it. But then came the phone call. His assistant, Taylor, burst into his office, her face pale. Barron, you need to see this. She handed him her phone. A news report was playing. Breaking. Fraud allegations against Trump's Home First project. Investigation underway. Barron's stomach tightened. He turned up the volume. Sources claim that funds allocated for the housing initiative may have been mismanaged, leading to an official investigation into the project's financials. Mismanaged, Barron muttered. That's a lie. Every dollar is accounted for. Taylor swallowed hard. They don't care if it's true. They just want to muddy the waters. Barron clenched his jaw. So this was their strategy. If they couldn't stop him legally, they'd try to destroy his reputation. But he wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, Barron called a press conference. Standing at the podium, he looked directly into the cameras. There are people who don't want this project to succeed, not because it's failing, but because it's working. His voice was firm. The Home First project has changed thousands of lives. And now, powerful people are afraid of what happens when we prove that solving homelessness isn't impossible. It just isn't profitable for them. He held up a thick folder. This is a full audit of our finances. Every cent is accounted for. But I'll do you one better. I'm calling for a federal investigation. If you want to look into me, then let's look into all of us. Let's investigate the banks, the real estate moguls, the politicians who have let this crisis go on for decades. The reporters exploded with questions, but Barron wasn't finished. I will not be bullied, and I will not stop fighting for these families. If you think you can scare me into backing down, he smirked. Think again. The video went viral. Within hours, Number I Stand with Barron was trending worldwide, and just like that, the attempt to destroy him backfired spectacularly. The investigation? It did happen. But instead of exposing corruption in the Home First project, it revealed shocking corruption in the very industries that had been fighting him. Housing developers caught manipulating rental markets. Banks exposed for blocking low-income buyers. Politicians exposed for accepting bribes to kill housing bills. The result? Laws changed. New policies were put in place to protect renters, to prevent unjust evictions, and to ensure housing was treated as a right, not a privilege. And Barron? He had done the impossible. One night, Barron stood on a rooftop overlooking New York City. Beside him was Adam, his old classmate, the boy whose struggles had started it all. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Adam asked. Barron nodded, staring at the skyline. "Yeah, if I hadn't found out about you that day, maybe none of this would have happened." Adam smiled. "I think it still would have, because you were always meant to do something bigger." Barron turned to him. "So were you." Adam laughed. "I don't have a billion-dollar housing project." Barron smirked. "Not yet." They both chuckled, then fell into a comfortable silence. And for the first time in years, Barron allowed himself to breathe. The fight wasn't over. There would always be more challenges, more battles to fight. But one thing was certain. He had already changed the world, and he was just getting started. Barron had expected resistance. But this was something else entirely. Because now, it wasn't just about shutting down Home First. It was about stopping him, permanently. The threat. It started subtly. A black SUV lingering outside his apartment. His phone ringing late at night, no caller ID. A cryptic email from an unknown sender. "Walk away while you still can." At first, Barron brushed it off. He wasn't going to be intimidated. But then, things escalated. One morning, Taylor burst into his office, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said, shoving her phone at him. Barron glanced down. It was a video, security footage from one of Home First's shelters. A masked man was breaking in, not to steal, to destroy. He tore down paperwork, smashed computers, set fire to stacks of files. Then he turned, looking straight into the camera, and lifted a piece of paper. 4 words. "Shut it down. Now." Barron's stomach dropped. This wasn't just corporate sabotage anymore. It was war. The fight back. "They think this will scare us," Barron said, his voice like steel. He stood at the head of the conference table, surrounded by his team. "But they made a mistake." Taylor leaned forward. "Which is?" Barron clenched his jaw. "They just proved how desperate they are." He pointed to the screen where the paused security footage still showed the masked man. "If Home First was failing, if we weren't making a difference, they wouldn't have to go this far." His team nodded. "So here's what we do," Barron said. "We rebuild, stronger. We double security. We back up every file. We expose this for what it is." Then he turned to Taylor. "I need you to track down who sent that email. Find out who's behind this." Taylor nodded. "On it." "And me?" said Ethan, Home First's operations manager. Barron locked eyes with him. "You're coming with me," he said. "We're going public." The announcement that shook the nation. The next day, Barron called for a press conference. The media swarmed, hungry for a response after the string of attacks. Cameras flashed, microphones stretched toward him. Barron stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat, and dropped a bombshell. Over the past few weeks, Home First has faced a series of attacks, not just in the media, but in real life. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Our shelters have been vandalized. Our team members threatened. We've received warnings telling us to stop." Barron looked straight into the cameras. "But let me be very clear. We're not stopping." The crowd exploded. News outlets rushed to cover the story. Social media erupted in support. "We stand with Barron" trended worldwide. But while the world rallied behind him, the people trying to stop him, they weren't done, because their next move would be the most dangerous yet. The night was cold. Barron pulled his jacket tighter as he stepped out of the building, his breath visible in the night air. He had just finished another meeting, another long discussion about how to keep Home First alive in the face of mounting threats. Taylor had made progress. She had traced the email. The people behind it? They weren't just anyone. They were powerful, connected, ruthless. They had everything to lose if Barron succeeded. And now? They were done warning him. As Barron approached his car, his phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. You should have walked away. And then, a loud pop. Tires screeching. A black SUV, the same one that had been watching him for weeks, peeled away from the curb. Barron's heart pounded as he ducked behind his car, his instincts taking over. By the time he stood up, they were gone. But the message was clear. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. They wanted him gone. Barron sat in his office, staring at the text. The threats weren't just about him. They were about everyone Home First was trying to help. Taylor stood by his desk, arms crossed. "You need security," she said firmly. "This is serious." Barron exhaled sharply. "They don't want security," he said. "They want us to be afraid." Taylor's jaw clenched. "Barron, they don't care about fear anymore. They're making moves." For the first time, he saw real worry in her eyes. "They could go after you," she whispered. "Or worse, someone at the shelters." Barron's stomach tightened. He couldn't let that happen. He needed a new strategy. He needed to hit them where it hurt. And then, it hit him. "We go to the top," Barron said. Taylor frowned. "What?" Barron leaned forward. "If these people are coming after us, it means we're threatening their money, their influence. That means someone powerful is backing them." Taylor's eyes widened. "You're saying we expose them?" Barron nodded. "We don't play defense anymore. We go on the attack." The next morning, Barron made a bold move. He called a meeting, not just with his team, but with investigators, journalists, and legal experts. "We're going to find out who's behind this," he told them. "We're going to uncover everything." Taylor had already started digging, and the deeper she went, the darker it got. Corrupt politicians, corporate executives, powerful investors, all connected to slumlords and shady housing deals. Home First was exposing a billion-dollar system of greed. And Barron? He was now their biggest problem. The threats escalated. More texts, more surveillance, more attempts to silence him. Then, one night, Barron came home to find his apartment ransacked, drawers emptied, papers shredded. One thing left on his kitchen table, a single envelope. He opened it, hands steady. Inside, a picture of his parents, and underneath one word, "Stop." His blood ran cold. This wasn't just about Home First anymore. They had made it personal, and that was their biggest mistake. Because now, Barron wasn't just fighting for the homeless. He was fighting for himself. And he was about to bring everything crashing down. Barron Trump stood in the wreckage of his apartment, his fists clenched, his mind racing. They had crossed the line. It wasn't just about stopping Home First anymore. They were coming after him, his family, his life. Taylor arrived minutes later, stepping through the broken doorway. Her face went pale. "Oh my God, Barron." She saw the torn furniture, the ransacked drawers, and then the photo. Her breath caught. "They know about your family," she whispered. "They know how to hurt you." Barron didn't answer. He couldn't. Because in that moment, something changed. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was furious, and now he was going to end this. The next morning, Barron didn't go to the office. He went straight to the media. He called in every favor, every journalist, every activist, every person who had ever wanted to take down the system that kept the homeless trapped. "We have proof," Barron told them. "We have names." Taylor handed them the files, secret contracts, hidden investments, shady political donations, the entire dirty web. Barron met their eyes. I need the world to see this, he said, before they try to stop me again. One reporter, a veteran journalist from the Washington Post, leaned forward. You realize what you're doing, don't you? She said. They won't just threaten you, they'll destroy you. Barron's answer was immediate. Let them try. The expose dropped 2 days later, and when it did, the world exploded. Headlines dominated the news. Billion-dollar housing scandal exposed. Corrupt landlords, politicians implicated. How one young man uncovered the truth. The reaction was instant. Protests erupted across the country. Lawsuits were filed. People demanded justice. And the powerful? They panicked. Because for the first time, they weren't the ones in control, but Barron wasn't done. Because while the world was watching, the real battle was just beginning. Late one night, he got the call. A voice he didn't recognize. You should have stopped. And then, gunfire. A warning shot, right outside his office. Barron ducked. Taylor screamed. Security rushed in, but the message was clear. This was war. And now, it was a fight Barron Trump had no intention of losing. Barron didn't flinch. The gunshot had barely faded before security scrambled to secure the building. Taylor's face was pale, her hands shaking as she grabbed his arm. We need to get out of here, she whispered. This isn't just politics anymore. Barron took a breath, forcing his heartbeat to steady. He knew this moment was coming. When you take on the people who run the system, you don't just face lawsuits and bad press. You face this. Threats, intimidation, violence, and yet, deep inside him, a fire burned. They wanted him to be afraid. They wanted him to back down. Not happening. Within an hour, the police were involved. The security footage was reviewed, the bullet casing bagged as evidence. But Barron could already tell how this would play out. No arrests, no real leads. This wasn't a random act. This was a warning, a promise. If you keep pushing, we will destroy you. And for the first time, Taylor seemed to realize the full weight of what they were up against. Barron, listen to me, she said, gripping his wrist. They aren't just some greedy businessmen anymore. These are people who have everything to lose. If we push them too far, they'll what? Barron interrupted, his voice steady. Scare me? Kill me? He shook his head. This isn't about me anymore, Taylor. He gestured to the city skyline outside his window. This is about them, the people out there who have nothing, the people these criminals have been exploiting for decades. His eyes darkened. If we stop now, we let them win. Taylor hesitated. Then slowly, she nodded. She wasn't just afraid anymore. She was angry, and she knew they weren't backing down. The next day, Barron made his move. He didn't just sit back and wait for the threats to escalate. He went on the attack. He called a press conference, standing in front of the world's cameras, his voice clear and unwavering. I want everyone to understand what's happening, he said. Last night, someone fired a gun outside my office. The reporters murmured in shock. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't an accident. It was a message. And that message was simple. Stop what you're doing, or else. He took a breath. Well, here's my message back. He looked straight into the cameras. I will not stop. The words hit like a thunderclap. Across the country, people watching at home sat forward in their seats. He was calling them out. I will not be intimidated. I will not let the corrupt and the powerful destroy what we've built. And I promise you, this is only the beginning. The world erupted. People took to the streets in record numbers. More whistleblowers came forward. And behind the scenes, the people who had tried to silence Barron, they were panicking because they'd made a mistake. They had underestimated him. The threats escalated overnight. Anonymous calls, shadowy figures tailing his car, private investigators harassing his team. Then, the ultimate warning. A black SUV pulled up outside Taylor's apartment. The driver never got out, never knocked, never said a word, just sat there. Watching, waiting. Taylor called Barron, her voice shaking. It's happening. They're coming after us. Barron clenched his jaw. He had expected this, but that didn't make it easier. They're desperate, he said. That means we're winning. But Taylor wasn't convinced. Winning doesn't matter if we don't survive. For the first time, Barron realized just how far this was going. This wasn't a political fight anymore. It was a war. And if they didn't move first, they would be taken out. The counterattack Barron gathered his closest allies. They met in a secret location, an old warehouse outside the city, away from prying eyes. Taylor was there, along with a small team of journalists, legal experts, and tech specialists. And then, Barron dropped the bombshell. These people have been running the system from the shadows for decades, he said. They think they're untouchable. He turned to a massive screen on the wall where a web of documents, emails, and financial transactions were displayed. Well, they're wrong. Taylor's eyes widened. Where did you get this? Barron smirked. Let's just say, some people in their own ranks aren't as loyal as they think. What they had wasn't just a scandal. It was a nuclear weapon. Evidence of fraud, bribes, offshore accounts, all leading to the highest levels of power. If this went public, the entire system would collapse. Taylor swallowed hard. If we release this, they won't just threaten us anymore. Barron nodded. I know. A heavy silence filled the room. Then, one by one, the team nodded. They were all in. The ticking clock. The moment they began preparing the release, the attacks intensified. Taylor's phone was hacked. Barron's legal team was flooded with bogus lawsuits. And then, the unthinkable. One of their key allies, Mark Phillips, a journalist working on the story, disappeared. His apartment was ransacked. His phone, gone. The police labeled it a missing persons case. But Barron knew the truth. Mark had been taken, and that meant they were out of time. We launch now, Barron said. No more waiting. Within hours, they uploaded everything. The documents, the recordings, the names. They sent it to every major news outlet, every social media platform, every single corner of the internet. There was no stopping it now. And the world, it erupted. The fallout government scrambled. CEOs resigned. The stock market crashed. And the people? They rose up. Protests flooded the streets. Millions demanded justice. Barron had done the impossible. He had exposed the system. But as he stood in his office watching the news unfold, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot, because the people he had just taken down, they weren't the type to forgive, they weren't the type to forget, and somewhere, in a dark room filled with powerful men, they were already planning their next move. The scatulation, the first sign that they were fighting back, was subtle. News anchors, ones who had covered the story aggressively at first, started changing their tone. They began questioning the legitimacy of the documents, talking about unverified sources, pushing the idea that the leak was a foreign operation. Then came the hit pieces. Barron Trump was labeled a radical, a conspiracy theorist, a dangerous young man playing with fire. Headlines questioned his credibility, his mental health, his intentions. And then, the real attack. The legal system was unleashed on him. He was hit with lawsuits from massive corporations that had been implicated in the leaks. He was subpoenaed by multiple government committees. The Justice Department opened an investigation into whether the information had been illegally obtained. And behind closed doors, powerful men were whispering one thing: take him down, no matter what it takes. The setup Barron knew they wouldn't just attack his reputation. They needed to do something bigger. So they tried to frame him. A private jet registered under a shell company was suddenly linked to Barron. It was found with millions of dollars in cash, offshore banking documents, and connections to criminal enterprises. Then came the whistleblower. An anonymous source, who the media immediately propped up, claimed Barron had coordinated the leak with foreign intelligence agencies. The government moved fast. An arrest warrant was issued. Barron Trump, the man who had exposed the system, was now a wanted fugitive. The narrative flipped overnight. He wasn't a hero anymore. Now, he was the villain. On the run, Barron barely had time to react. He had to disappear. Taylor and the rest of his team scattered. Their phones were compromised, their bank accounts frozen. Every security measure they thought would protect them? Gone. Barron was forced underground. He moved through safe houses, avoiding surveillance, always one step ahead. But there was one problem. They weren't just after him. They were after everyone who had helped him. Taylor's apartment was raided. Mark Phillips, the journalist who had gone missing, he turned up, dead. And the message was clear. This wasn't just a takedown, it was a warning. The comeback for weeks. Barron was silent. The world thought he had either fled the country or was locked away somewhere. But then, a message appeared. A single video. It was dark, the footage grainy, but the voice unmistakable. "This fight isn't over," Barron said. "They can smear me. They can hunt me. But the truth is already out. And I promise you, this is just the beginning." The world erupted. Within hours, number "We Stand with Barron" was trending worldwide. People weren't buying the official narrative. They knew what was happening. Barron Trump wasn't just a fugitive. He was a symbol. And the system had made a fatal mistake. Because the more they tried to erase him, the stronger he became. The world wasn't ready for what came next. The government had labeled him a fugitive. The media had buried him under an avalanche of lies. His name was dragged through the mud, his character assassinated, his allies hunted. And yet, he was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting, planning. The system thought they had won, but they had underestimated him. Because Barron Trump wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to burn their entire empire to the ground. The war begins. The first sign of retaliation came in the form of a second leak. This one was even bigger. The files contained names, accounts, secret dealings. It wasn't just corporations. It wasn't just politicians. It was judges, generals, world leaders, people who had rigged the system for decades. The document dump was unlike anything the world had seen before. And the message, crystal clear. Barron Trump wasn't gone. He was just getting started. The establishment was in full-blown panic. They scrambled to control the narrative. But this time, it didn't work. Because the world had woken up. Millions of people flooded the streets in protest. Governments were thrown into crisis mode. Barron's movement wasn't just surviving. It was taking over. The last play. With the world watching, Barron made his next move. A live broadcast. No fancy studios. No mainstream media filters. Just him sitting in a dark room, speaking directly to the people. He exposed everything. The backroom deals, the bribes, the puppet masters who had pulled the strings for far too long. And then, he issued a challenge. If the system wants me gone, they'll have to face me in the light. No more shadows, no more lies. The people deserve the truth, and I won't stop until they have it. The world erupted. The establishment had tried to destroy him. Instead, they had created a revolution. The final stand. The government had no choice. They couldn't arrest him now, not with millions of people behind him. So they tried one last move, a smear campaign bigger than anything before. Fake scandals, fabricated evidence, a desperate attempt to break him. But it was too late. The people didn't believe them anymore. Barron had done the impossible. He had beaten the system. And as he stood before a sea of supporters, ready to lead them into a new future, one built on truth, justice, and freedom, he realized something. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was history in the making. The war was over, and the people had won. The world will never be the same. It had been weeks since the story first broke. At first, it was just whispers, a few social media posts, a couple of obscure news articles, but then something changed. The story refused to die. No matter how hard they tried to bury it, no matter how many distractions they threw at the public, people kept talking. Barron Trump had changed the life of a homeless classmate. But how far did it go? The mainstream media tried to frame it as a nice gesture, a simple act of kindness from a privileged teenager. But those who looked closer, they saw something else. They saw a pattern. Because this wasn't the first time Barron Trump had done something like this. And it wouldn't be the last. The bigger picture. It started with a single question. If he was willing to do this for one person, how many more has he helped in secret? That question turned into an investigation, and what they found shocked the world. It wasn't just one classmate. It wasn't just one school. There were dozens of cases. Kids who had disappeared from school, only to reappear weeks later, completely transformed. Families who had been struggling in silence, suddenly finding their burdens lifted. Anonymous donations, rent paid off, medical bills cleared, and the only connection between all of them? Barron Trump. The truth comes out. A journalist from an independent media outlet finally broke the full story. Barron Trump has been secretly funding struggling families, helping classmates in need, and using his own wealth to change lives. And he's been doing it for years. The internet exploded. People demanded answers. But Barron? He stayed silent. No press conferences, no statements, no interviews. He didn't want recognition, because for him, it was never about that. It was about doing the right thing. A legacy of kindness. As more stories surfaced, something remarkable happened. People started paying it forward. Strangers began helping strangers. People covered rent for families in need. They left food at the doorsteps of those too proud to ask for help. And every time someone did, they'd leave a small note behind. A simple message. Just paying it forward. BT. It was never confirmed whether Barron had anything to do with it. But at that point, it didn't matter, because the kindness he had started, it had become unstoppable. And years from now, when people looked back, they wouldn't just remember Barron Trump as a public figure. They'd remember him as the young man who proved that one act of kindness could change the world. Even as the world tried to digest the story, the truth kept unraveling in ways no one expected. Journalists continued digging, uncovering more and more stories about the quiet ways Barron Trump had impacted lives. There was the janitor at his school who had been struggling to pay medical bills for his wife. One day, an envelope appeared in his locker, enough to cover her treatments entirely. No name, no explanation. Just a simple note that read, "Take care of her. You're not alone." Then there was the cafeteria worker who had suddenly found herself evicted after her landlord unexpectedly sold the building. A mysterious donor paid for a new apartment lease in full, for an entire year. She had no idea who it was until, one morning, Barron passed her in the hallway and simply said, "Hope the new place feels like home." And what about the quiet boy in his history class? The one no one noticed was struggling until the day his mother broke down in tears at the principal's office, saying they couldn't afford to keep him in school. The tuition had been covered the very next day. No questions asked. Every time someone tried to confront Barron about these things, he just shook his head and smiled. "It's nothing," he'd say, "just trying to help." But as the media frenzy grew, so did the people who wanted to discredit him. Some called it a publicity stunt. Others said it was just his family's money trying to fix their reputation. And then, there were those who wanted to stop him entirely. Because powerful people didn't like what Barron was doing. He was showing the world that kindness didn't need bureaucracy, that you didn't need a foundation, a government program, or a committee to help someone. You just did it. And that terrified them. The attempt to silence him. As more people came forward with stories of Barron's quiet generosity, there was a sudden shift in the media. Articles stopped praising him. Instead, they started digging into his life. They called him privileged. They said his help was performative. Some even questioned whether his acts of kindness were a distraction from bigger issues. But Barron? He didn't care. He just kept going. A plan no one saw coming. Then, something unexpected happened. Barron had been silent for weeks. No public statements, no interviews, no comments. People thought maybe he'd given up, but in reality, he was planning something even bigger. One morning, without warning, an anonymous donation was made to several schools across the country. A donation large enough to erase every single outstanding lunch debt for students. That same day, 5 homeless shelters received massive shipments of blankets, food, and supplies, enough to last them months. And then, an orphanage in New York City was fully funded for an entire year. The only clue about who was behind it. A letter sent to each location. No signature. No contact information. Just 5 simple words. Pass it on. BT. And just like that, the message spread. It wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about status. It was about people helping people. One act at a time. And no matter what the world tried to do to stop it, nothing could. The storm around Barron Trump only grew, as news outlets scrambled to uncover the truth behind his anonymous acts of kindness. Some were determined to turn the narrative against him. The media, political figures, even social commentators. They all wanted their angle. Some praised him, calling him a beacon of hope in a cynical world. Others scoffed, saying it was easy to be generous when you grew up in wealth. But the truth was something none of them were prepared for. Because behind the scenes, Barron wasn't just donating money, a plan no one saw coming. Then, something unexpected happened. Barron had been silent for weeks. No public statements, no interviews, no comments. People thought maybe he'd given up, but in reality, he was planning something even bigger. One morning, without warning, an anonymous donation was made to several schools across the country. A donation large enough to erase every single outstanding lunch debt for students. That same day, 5 homeless shelters received massive shipments of blankets, food, and supplies, enough to last them months. And then, an orphanage in New York City was fully funded for an entire year. The only clue about who was behind it. A letter sent to each location. No signature. No contact information. Just 5 simple words. Pass it on. BT. And just like that, the message spread. It wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about status. It was about people helping people. One act at a time. And no matter what the world tried to do to stop it, nothing could. The storm around Barron Trump only grew, as news outlets scrambled to uncover the truth behind his anonymous acts of kindness. Some were determined to turn the narrative against him. The media, political figures, even social commentators. They all wanted their angle. Some praised him, calling him a beacon of hope in a cynical world. Others scoffed, saying it was easy to be generous when you grew up in wealth. But the truth was something none of them were prepared for. Because behind the scenes, Barron wasn't just donating money. He was changing lives in ways no one had ever expected. Barron's classmate, the one he had quietly helped when he learned he was homeless, had moved into his new apartment with his mother. They had gone from sleeping in shelters to having a warm bed, from wondering where their next meal would come from, to a stocked fridge and cabinets full of food. And Barron? He didn't just stop at paying for their apartment. He made sure the mother had a stable job. He reached out, quietly, behind the scenes, and arranged an opportunity for her at one of his father's hotels. A managerial position, no handouts, no charity, just an opportunity to rebuild her life. When she received the offer, she broke down in tears. It wasn't just a job. It was dignity, a second chance. She had no idea how to thank him. And Barron? He simply smiled and said, "Just take care of him." But the world wasn't done testing him. Because the more good he did, the more people wanted to bring him down. One journalist, known for aggressive investigative pieces, decided to dig into Barron's finances. He wanted to prove that it wasn't. People began whispering. Who was behind all this? And then, one night, someone caught a glimpse of him. Barron Trump, wearing a simple hoodie and jeans, helping unload boxes at a shelter. No cameras, no bodyguards, just one kid trying to make a difference. And the internet? Lost it. The image went viral within hours. Some refused to believe it. It has to be staged. Why would he be there alone? This has to be a PR stunt. But those who had met him, those who had seen what he'd done, they knew the truth. Barron Trump wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just doing what needed to be done. And then, the biggest twist of all. One evening, as Barron was leaving school, a black car pulled up beside him. The windows rolled down, and inside, a man he had never seen before. Dressed in a sharp suit, the man studied Barron with a quiet smile. "You don't know me," he said, "but I've been watching what you've been doing." Barron tensed, unsure of what this was about. "I represent a group of people who believe in what you're doing, people who have the resources to make an even bigger impact, and we want you to be part of it." Barron frowned. "Who are you?" The man smiled. "Let's just say, we're people who believe that true power isn't in money, it's in the ability to change lives." And then, he handed Barron a card, no name, no phone number, just an address, and 5 simple words. "Come if you're ready." Barron watched as the car pulled away, his heart pounding. Who were these people? And more importantly, was he ready to find out? The choice that changed everything. That night, Barron sat alone, staring at the card. He could walk away. He could keep doing what he was doing, helping people in his own quiet way. Or he could step into something bigger, something unknown. The decision weighed heavily on him. And then, just before midnight, he made his choice. He grabbed his jacket, took a deep breath, and walked out the door, toward the address, toward his next chapter, and toward a destiny that would change everything. Barron Trump didn't know what to expect when he arrived at the mysterious address. It was a quiet street in a part of town he didn't recognize. No flashy signs, no security, just a plain, nondescript building with a single light above the entrance. For a moment, he hesitated. Was this a mistake? He thought about turning around, but something inside him, a gut feeling, an instinct, told him to push forward. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. Silence. Then, after a few seconds, the door creaked open. A man greeted him, the same man from the car. No words were exchanged. Just a simple nod as he stepped aside, motioning Barron inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, Barron felt it. This was not just some ordinary meeting. He was walking into something far bigger than himself. The room was dimly lit. A long table stretched across the center, where several figures sat in silence. Men and women, of different ages, different backgrounds. Some were dressed in formal suits, others in casual attire. All of them, however, shared one thing in common. They were watching him. The man from the car gestured toward an empty seat. "Have a seat, Barron." Barron hesitated, then walked forward, lowering himself into the chair. "Do you know why you're here?" the man asked. Barron shook his head. "Because you've been doing something most people in your position don't do," the man continued. "You didn't just throw money at a problem. You didn't seek credit. You found people who needed help, and you helped them in ways that actually mattered." A woman sitting across from him leaned forward. "That kind of mindset is rare, and we've been looking for someone like you." Barron frowned. "Looking for me? For what?" The man smiled. "To be part of something much bigger." As the conversation unfolded, Barron began to understand. This wasn't some secret society. This wasn't about power or influence. This was about impact. The people sitting at the table weren't just businessmen or politicians. They were game changers. Philanthropists, innovators, visionaries who had spent years working behind the scenes, quietly changing the world. They had funded hospitals in war zones, built schools in impoverished communities, created programs that helped struggling families get back on their feet, without any publicity, without any headlines. They had dedicated their lives to solving problems that governments and corporations ignored. And now? They wanted Barron to join them. "You have a choice," the man said. "You can keep doing what you're doing, helping one person at a time, making a difference in small but powerful ways." He paused. "Or you can step onto a much bigger stage, a global one." Barron felt his pulse quicken. "What would that mean?" he asked. The woman across from him smiled. "It means resources," she said. "It means access to people who can help you scale what you're doing to levels you never imagined." "And it means risk," the man added. "The more impact you have, the more enemies you make. Not everyone wants to see real change." Barron nodded slowly. He had already seen that firsthand. The media had tried to twist his intentions. Some people had gone out of their way to discredit him. But did that mean he should stop? If anything, it meant he needed to go even further. "How does this work?" Barron finally asked. The man smiled. "One step at a time." And just like that, Barron Trump's real journey began. Over the next few months, he was introduced to some of the most powerful and influential change-makers in the world. Billionaires who didn't just donate money, they strategically invested in solutions. Scientists working on breakthrough medical treatments that had been buried by bureaucracy. Educators who had figured out how to completely transform failing school systems, but had been silenced by politicians who wanted to maintain the status quo. Barron was no longer just a kid with a good heart and a willingness to help. He was stepping into a world that most people never even knew existed. And with it came a level of danger he never expected. One evening, Barron returned to his apartment and found a letter slipped under his door. No return address, no signature, just a single sentence. "Stop what you're doing. You don't know who you're messing with." For a moment, he felt a chill run down his spine. Who had sent this? Who was watching him? He considered telling his father, or maybe the people from the organization, but then he thought about the people he had already helped, the single mother who had a second chance, the families who no longer had to worry about eviction, the children who now had a shot at a real education. Was he supposed to stop now? He refused to be intimidated. If anything, this just proved he was on the right path. So instead of backing down, Barron did something unexpected. He went public. For the first time, Barron spoke out. Not in a press conference, not in a heavily scripted interview, but in a raw, unfiltered video. He sat in front of the camera, no fancy production, no team behind him. "People keep asking why I do what I do," he began. "The truth? I don't do it for attention. I don't do it for praise. I do it because I believe we all have the ability and the responsibility to make life better for the people around us. But what I've learned is that not everyone wants to see that happen." He held up the anonymous letter. "Someone sent me this today. I don't know who they are. I don't know what they want. But if they think a threat is going to stop me..." He smiled. "They don't know me very well." The video broke the internet. Within hours, it was trending worldwide. Millions of people shared it. Celebrities spoke out in support. Philanthropists offered their help. Even those who had once doubted him were starting to believe. And the people who had sent the warning, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because now, the whole world was watching. Barron Trump was no longer just a wealthy kid with good intentions. He was leading a movement. And whether his enemies liked it or not, he was just getting started. The night air was crisp. the city lights flickering like distant stars as Barron Trump sat in the back of the black SUV, staring out the window. His mind was still replaying everything he had learned earlier that day. The revelation had been like a punch to the gut. One of his classmates, someone he had seen every day at school, wasn't just struggling. He was homeless. The thought gnawed at Barron, unsettling him in a way he couldn't shake. How could someone he knew, someone who sat in the same classrooms, laughed at the same jokes, and walked the same hallways, be living in such a different reality? It didn't sit right with him. The conversation had happened by accident. Barron had stayed late after class to finish an assignment in the library, and as he was packing up, he overheard two students whispering in hushed voices. The words "homeless shelter" caught his attention. At first, he thought he misheard, but as he listened closer, he realized they were talking about a classmate. Daniel, a quiet kid who never caused trouble, never asked for attention. The pieces suddenly fit together. The slightly oversized clothes, the way he never talked about home, how he always stayed late at school. Barron's stomach twisted. He had never really thought about it before, but now he couldn't think of anything else. The conversation had happened by accident. Barron had stayed late after class to finish an assignment in the library, and as he was packing up, he overheard two students whispering in hushed voices. The words "homeless shelter" caught his attention. At first, he thought he misheard, but as he listened closer, he realized they were talking about a classmate. Daniel, a quiet kid who never caused trouble, never asked for attention. The pieces suddenly fit together. The slightly oversized clothes, the way he never talked about home, how he always stayed late at school. Barron's stomach twisted. He had never really thought about it before, but now he couldn't think of anything else. That night at dinner, Barron sat across from his parents, picking at his food. Melania noticed immediately. "You're quiet tonight," she said, watching him carefully. "I just found something out today, about someone at school." He hesitated, then set down his fork. "One of my classmates is homeless." Donald looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. "Who?" "His name's Daniel. I overheard some kids talking about how he and his mom live in a shelter." Melania's brow furrowed with concern. "That's terrible," she murmured. Barron nodded. "Yeah, and the worst part is, no one knows. No one talks about it. He acts like everything's fine, but it's not. I don't know. It just doesn't feel right that he has to go through that alone." Donald leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "You want to help him?" Barron nodded firmly. "Yeah, but I don't know how." There was a pause, then his father set down his glass and met his eyes. "Then figure it out." The words were simple, but they carried weight, and Barron knew what they meant. His father had built an empire by solving problems. If something didn't sit right, he didn't complain. He took action. That night, Barron couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with possibilities. Buying Daniel some new clothes wouldn't fix the problem. Giving him money wouldn't either. Not really. He needed something bigger, something that would actually change things. The next morning, Barron woke up with a plan. At school, he spotted Daniel sitting alone in the cafeteria, eating slowly. His tray was almost empty. Barron grabbed his lunch and walked over. "Hey, mind if I sit here?" Daniel studied him, skeptical. "Then why are you?" Barron exhaled. "Because I want to help. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to figure it out." Daniel scoffed. "Look, man, I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Barron countered. "It's just making things right." Daniel shook his head, looking away. "There is no making things right. It is what it is." But Barron wasn't convinced. That afternoon, he went to the one person who always had answers, his mother. Melania listened patiently as Barron explained everything. When he finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "Helping someone isn't just about giving them something," she said gently. It's about making sure they can help themselves. Barron thought about that. So, what do I do? She smiled. You start by listening. And that's exactly what Barron did. Over the next few days, he made a point to talk to Daniel more. Not about his situation, but about normal things. Sports, music, their favorite movies. Slowly, Daniel began to let his guard down. One day, as they were walking out of school together, Daniel sighed. You really want to help? Yeah. Then find my mom a job. Barron blinked. A job? Daniel nodded. She's been looking for months. No one wants to hire someone who doesn't have a stable address. That's the real problem. If she had a job, we wouldn't be in the shelter. We'd be okay. That night, Barron went straight to his father. Do you know anyone who's hiring? Donald raised an eyebrow. For what? Barron hesitated. For a single mom. She's got experience in admin work, but no one will hire her because she's in a shelter. His father leaned back, considering. Then, without a word, he picked up his phone and made a call. The next morning, Daniel came to school looking different, hopeful. My mom has an interview, he said, disbelief in his voice. Some company called last night. They said someone recommended her personally. He looked at Barron, his voice quieter. Did you? Barron just smiled. 2 weeks later, Daniel and his mom moved into an apartment. It wasn't big, but it was theirs. And when Daniel walked into school that Monday morning, he didn't look like a kid carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders anymore. Barron didn't tell anyone what he had done. He didn't want the credit. He just wanted to know that when he walked into that cafeteria and saw Daniel sitting there, this time surrounded by friends, he had made a difference. Because sometimes, helping someone isn't about grand gestures or headlines. Sometimes it's about seeing a problem and choosing to do something about it. And for Barron Trump, that was just the beginning.